Hello everyone and welcome to Otaku Go here on the Gunpla Network. I'm the Spicer and today we'll be taking a look at the excellent model series RAH-DX, Gundam Archives Neo Sayla Mass from MegaHouse. This figure was kindly sent to us by none other than Side 7 Exports. Side 7 Exports is your one-stop shop for all things premium and exclusive. Side 7 stocks a variety of merch, not only kits, but a lot of other things that the Gundam bases may carry. From Gundam base exclusive products like mugs, stands, all that fun stuff, to premium Bandai model kits, they'll likely have your hard-to-find grails for your collection. When you're placing your next order, don't forget to use the promo code GUNPLANetwork10 to save 10% off. Now with that out of the way, what do we get with this figure? Well, of course, the first thing we get is a nice large box. Being 1/8 scale, it's a pretty good sized figure, and I'll compare it against some other things I've got in a little bit to give you a better idea of that. We have a large window running down the front and along the side. While there's some protective white plastic in there, it mostly just covers the uniform so you'll get a good idea as far as face sculpts and things like that without having to open the box. Now, of course, there are a variety of product images across the box entirely. We have Sayla with the standard issue Federation pistol on both sides, a smaller version on the windowed side, and on the other side you'll also have her in her saluting pose and the core booster in the background. On the back we see a variety of posing options with both different pistols and the saluting pose again. Overall, I'm incredibly pleased with this figure. It's a pretty big step up from the prize figures I've been collecting so far, and while it's not super flashy, it is very solid and very well executed. You have swappable parts, crisp paint application, great shading, and a really clean sculpt. It's one of my favorite things in my collection now, including all my model kits and other things. This figure shines pretty much in every category. The paintwork is thoughtfully done with no paint bleed or lightly coated areas. The colors chosen are also very nice and very well thought out. The semi-metallic gold contrasts nice with the pink, the flat pink of the uniform, making the belt and zipper portions pop quite a bit. The pink of the uniform is also slightly more of a red hue, leaving the white upper portion to stand on its own without being blended into a sea of bright colors. Now I will say the red on the shoulders, the neck, and the cuffs does blend together more with the pink since it's a reddish hue, but the shading does go a long way to make it look like multiple pieces instead of one uniform piece. The white leggings are really nothing to write home about in terms of painting at the very least, but the boots are surprisingly eye-catching. A nice reddish hue of brown on these cowboy boots and some excellent shading work does a lot to draw your eye down to the bottom of this figure. It's not a lot, not every day that you see figures, and there's not a lot of them, that have shoes that are this eye-catching and this well done, but Sayla has some really nice cowboy boots. Moving back to the top for a more detailed look, the head is nice, but probably the weakest part of this figure as a whole. Not that it's actually bad, but in terms of paint, it's not got a lot going on. Really, the only things you have are the eyes and a little bit on the lips, depending on the face sculpt. The eyes are a really nice deep blue, and we even get a little bit of light pink on the lips, so they do stand out a little bit more, but the rest of the face is kind of just there. And, well, I'll talk about it more in the sculpt section. The sculpt's not like super sharp, it's not super soft, so it's kind of a good in between, but it just doesn't stick out, which it's not supposed to, but just something to note if you like figure faces. This may be on the slightly blander side. Now, as I said, you do get two head sculpts, and from what I've been able to tell, they're actually the same, or at least practically speaking. It could just be a replacement head, that's totally possible. I know some of these figures come with those. Could also be a slightly different angled peg, so that it works better with the saluting hand. But I've been able to use both heads with the saluting hand with really no difference in terms of hand contact to the hair. So I'm not really sure exactly if maybe it's just a very, very slight degree off to where it touches it slightly less or what. But that's just kind of there. You have two heads. Visually speaking, they're the same. Maybe a slight angle difference, but not a huge one. Maybe just a few degrees. One thing I will say though is the hair doesn't really live up to the rest of this figure. Sure, from a front-on viewpoint, it actually looks pretty good, but any lower angles, you're going to see the bottom of the hair, and it's almost entirely solid, flat plastic. There's not a lot of depth, there's not a lot of dimension, and while her hair is short and not flowing, it still feels a little weird. I'm not sure exactly what I would have wanted here, maybe a little bit more in terms of surface variation or some paint or something, but this does stand out pretty hard in terms of, like, if you've got it higher up on a shelf. Now, if you've got it eye level or lower, you're not going to notice this, and it's kind of a nitpick because there's not a lot of, like, even mildly concerning things to say about this figure, but it is something to be aware of. If it's going to be on your shelf and that kind of thing bothers you, kind of take that as you will. Now, I will say as well, the only real major seam line you're going to see on this figure is in the hair. A little surprising. I know that, it isn't, the $400, $500, $600 figurines or statues or whatever, but it is kind of strange that for a MegaHouse figure, this is still here. Front on, you really don't notice it, but anytime you get kind of a side angle, it is going to be very noticeable. And while personally, that's not a deal breaker for me, I know the seam lines can be a big deal for some people, so I wanted to bring it to your attention just in case. Now, before we get into the actual sculpting of the figurine itself, I wanted to take a look at some of the interchangeable parts, because those are a little easier to look at individually versus being on the figure, because the figure can kind of draw some attention away from that. But we have the two head sculpts here, and I've turned these head sculpts into a find the difference picture game, because at first I was like, these are the same, but the longer I've looked at them, the more probably fake differences I've made up. I'm thinking there's some coloration difference in the paint, there's some angle difference, there's a very minor degree of expression difference, a very minor degree of sculpt difference, and they're probably almost the same. But I wanted to give you guys a visual representation side to side so that you can judge for yourself, because I've gone crazy looking at these. Now, the hands are very obviously different, one for saluting, one for holding the pistols. And I do want to note here, because I forgot to note it in the paint section, the fingernails on all of the different hand sculpts are painted, which is kind of impressive. They're a very fleshy tone, so they don't really stand out, but they do have a glossy finish on them, so when light hits them, they do shine more than pretty much anything else on the figure. It's kind of the only thing that has a fairly high gloss finish on it, so kind of a neat thing. Not really, world shattering, but it's cool that it's there. And then you have the pistols themselves, the standard issue Federation and Xeon ones. The Xeon one is a little bit bigger and has a little bit less in terms of paint. The hand grip does have its little silver pin in there, as well as some silver paint on the trigger. The trigger does stand out a little bit more on this one as well. The Federation one's going to blend more into Sayla as it's smaller. It kind of fits in the hand size-wise a little bit better. Neither one's loose, but the Xeon pistol looks really big in her hand. The Federation, you also get the hand grip with some texturing and 2 pins this time. More texturing along the top for the slide. And the trigger is really nothing special to write home about here, but it is nice you get both variations. So if you're a Federation fan or a Xeon head, you've got 2 options here, and if you don't like either, you've got the saluting pose, so it's nice that it has this kind of variation. Now, in terms of the sculpt, I will say that even, starting from the top, the hair being the most kind of unimpressive part to me of this figure does have a degree of movement and a degree of layering. And while the bottom is still very weird that it's just like flat plastic, don't understand why they did that. The rest of the hair looks pretty good. It has some movement and looks kind of flowy. It's not very long, so you don't get a lot of exaggerated movement in strands and stuff, but you do get some texturing in there, which is nice. Down onto the uniform though, which is where this sculpt really shines. This uniform is like one of the most realistic pieces of clothing in terms of sculpts and pulls and bunching and stuff that I've seen in any of the figures I have. Around the shoulders, it's going to kind of bunch up a little bit depending on Sayla's arm movement, which is really cool. You have some movement down the back. You have movement onto the sleeves, down around the elbows. You have movement down around the belt, where it's kind of being tucked in and pulled a little bit. And it's just one of those things, they didn't have to do a lot of that. And, for a MegaHouse figure and kind of its price point, expect them to. But they do execute it very well here. And for being a very, I'd say, form-fitting piece of clothing that doesn't allow a lot of flowy bits, it does a good job of selling that it's there. And it does most of that through the sculpt. And the sculpt will kind of partner into the shading with that of, you want the shading to be complementary to the sculpt, because the reason the shade is there is usually because of the sculpt itself. Now, moving kind of down to the skirt portion of the uniform, it does have a little bit of a flow out to one side. Once again, it's really not, it's just a very long shirt effectively, so it's not going to have a lot of movement, but they do try to sell a little bit there. There's some curvature around her butt for some reason when it's not touching her butt, which is very confusing, but, figure people are like, hey, the butt, it exists, she got the booty, stuff like that. And then you get the white leggings underneath, which I would say maybe not the most disappointing, but the most no reason to talk about in this review. There's not anything really paint-wise going on, there's not a lot of shading, there's some sculpt in terms of bunching and stuff, but that's really only around the knee. However, the big show stealer on the bottom portion of this kit are these cowboy boots, and these are the most surprisingly cool portion of this figurine. I don't even remember if Sayla wears cowboy boots throughout Mobile Suit Gundam, but they're here and they look great. You have a lot of exaggerated shading on them, they stand out a lot against the white of the leggings, and they have, for some cowboy boots, a fairly surprising amount of motion. They have bends and creases in them, the tops stick out just a hair, and they look really impressive. I'm very surprised that boots are one of the coolest parts of this figure. But I mean, that just goes to show how much attention to detail and stuff they put into this. Now, the base itself, not too much to write home about. It is clear, it has the Federation logo on it, and it has a blue rim, which is a very nice kind of metallic flat blue. So it stands out against the boots very, very nicely. Now, to round out this review, I wanted to provide as many comparisons as I could without going too crazy. So we have a pretty good variation, oddly enough, all Bandai. But if we start down with our little Saber down there in her suit, that's from Fate Zero, so that's an early 2010s figurine. It's one of the older ones I have, and it's quite a bit smaller. It's a Bam Presto figure. So it's okay, it's good for what it is, but it's of course not going to have the detailing that Sayla's going to have. But it is a nice representation of something older and smaller. We move over to Vegeta. He's a fairly new figurine, and you can kind of see the progress in terms of what they've done with the sculpt, with the muscles and the kind of blue jumpsuit thingy underneath. Then you get Sayla being a little bit bigger, but maybe not in scale, of course, with Vegeta. I don't know, Vegeta's pretty short, so maybe it is in scale. And then you have the Grandista Naruto there on the end. So you have a nice variation of size. It fits kind of in the middle, so if you've got a lot of Grandista figures, it's going to be just a little bit smaller than that. But I imagine if you have any of the Gundam Guide generation or any of the other excellent model series, it's going to fit pretty in close with them being in 1/8 scale. Now, we kind of get some detailed looks here. You get a little bit better look there at Saber. You're going to get a better look here at Vegeta. You see a lot more of the exaggerated shading here as well. Seems like a newer Bandai, real big focus point for them. Then you get Sayla, where it kind of tones it down, but it still has it, and it has it where it makes sense. So they're not going for exaggerated looks. They're going for, I'd say, maybe pseudo-realistic, if we're kind of trying to term them. And then, as we move on to Naruto here, you get to see a pretty big contrast once again in terms of that sculpt with the clothing being moving. Now, of course, Naruto's original uniform is a little bit more flowing and loose-fitting, so you have some more of that. But regardless, it's still just fine. I think by comparison, we once again get to see that exaggeration versus kind of the pseudo-realism that MegaHouse was going for. And as I round this out here, I have to say that if you're a big Sayla fan or original Mobile Suit Gundam fan, this is something you're probably going to want to keep an eye out on. Now, I will take this moment to acknowledge that MegaHouse's kind of exclusivity of Gundam characters has made MegaHouse more of kind of like a premium brand without going too crazy. This happens with the Gundam Guy Generation stuff, their Cosmo Fleet Special ships, pretty much anything Gundam related that that MegaHouse does gets really expensive on the secondary market. So if this is something you like, I would definitely say search around, find a price you're comfortable with, but know that these aren't something like model kits that get a big release and then a bunch of reissues. This may be like one of the few production runs of this. So keep that in mind. If you like it, find a good price, try to get it sooner rather than later, because the longer you wait on that secondary market, the more that price is going to balloon, because there are fewer and fewer people selling it, and it's going to be secondhand a lot of those instances. Even if it's mint in box, your secondary market is going to be your only option, and it's going to go crazy. But overall, if you're original Mobile Suit Gundam or Sayla, yeah, it's a really, really cool looking piece. It has some options for posing, and it's going to look good next to like your master grades, your high grades, your real grades, whatever model kit you have. It's kind of a nice extra little bit of flash there. It's really cool looking. But those have been my thoughts. If you have this figurine, do let us know in the comments below what you've thought about it, and if I'm crazy and those head sculpts are absolutely not the same. If you have any questions about it, I will do my best to answer them. And other than that, friends, please stay safe and keep on collecting.